This is going to be the history of Robert Manning Rodgers, uh, and I will share the screen. This is uh, he's my great 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 uncle. Uh, my my great great grandfather was his half brother, and this is and doing research on some genealogical aspects of my family, particularly George Washington Carpenter, who served in the 41st Mississippi Infantry. I came across um, first through my aunt who did genealogical information, but I had lost the information to begin with a long time ago. But this is kind of a rare account that was first shared in Edwin E. Barris's book on the Jenkins Ferry battle in 1864. His was referenced, I think it was originally published in the Sheridan Headlight, a newspaper, and was originally written by Robert Manning Rodgers to get his veterans benefits. And anyway, I'll go ahead and share this presentation that I made, and it's basically his life story, which covers not only his early life in Noxubee, Mississippi, in particular Bigbee Valley, which is the community of Bigbee Valley is right on the Tombigbee River, right on the Alabama-Mississippi border in Noxubee County. Much of the business in that area, I think the larger town was Pickensville across the border in Alabama. So about half the family was born in Pickensville, Alabama, and others in Bigbee Valley, Noxubee County, Mississippi. But anyway, I'll go ahead and share the screen and let Robert Manning Rodgers tell his own story, and hope you enjoy it. Particularly, it covers, like I said, the beginning of his history, his mother and father, which was John Rodgers, who and Mary Love Carpenter Rodgers. Mary Love Carpenter was previously married, had three children, which I'll show in here. And John Rodgers also had family from his previous wife. And then Robert Manning Rodgers was the product of their new marriage, along with two other sisters. So it was quite a large family. But anyway, I'll go ahead and share screen here, and we will as soon as I figure out how to do that, we will share screen. Um, with this, and I will share. Let's see, I'm going to share this slideshow that I presented here. We'll go from the beginning. This is Robert Manning, the life of Robert Manning Rodgers. He served in Company B, the 26th Arkansas Infantry, and enlisted approximately in 1863. I found this picture of Robert Manning Rodgers on a website about Jenkins Ferry, and it was cited as being Robert Manning Rodgers, but I tried to contact the website administrator to get the information in regard to where that information came from, the picture, and I have never heard back from him, uh, the the site owner. So anyway, this is apparently probably most likely a picture of Robert Manning Rodgers. And when I continue with the story, you'll see that there is a similarity of the photograph that's in his life story to this gentleman here. He would have been approximately about 17, 18 years old in this picture, and probably in the enlistment in the regiment in 1863. I'll go ahead and go to the next slide. This here is a outline of the family members mentioned in the biography of John Robert M. Rodgers. You'll see John M. Rodgers had previous children, William Rodgers. William, I believe, also served, but these are the brothers whose regimental histories of which I know at this point. I believe William Rodgers may have served in the 41st Mississippi with Uh, George Washington Carpenter, my direct ancestor, also known as G.W. Carpenter. Uh, these two, John M. Rodgers and Mary Love Carpenter, both passed away in 1859. It's not stated as to why they passed away at the same time, but it's probably believed that they caught an illness and both died at the same time. At the time of the illness, about half the brothers of stepbrothers and half brothers moved to Arkansas in Ashley County in the vicinity of Hamburg, Arkansas, and the outlying areas. And the others stayed in the area of there. Apparently, they were the property was in probate, and the property was to be settled, but unfortunately, the war broke out, and um, that property was subsequently lost, and the family pretty much destroyed. There was a lot of brothers, especially on the Rodgers side, that passed away in the war. James Rodgers served in the Company B as well, 26 Arkansas Infantry, and he was killed at Prairie Grove. John Rodgers, I have not been able to identify him. William Rodgers, I believe, served in the 41st Mississippi Company D that was formed outside in Noxubee County. George Rodgers apparently was enlisted in Company C, 5th Alabama. He would have crossed over the border and enlisted in Pickens County, Alabama. Jane Rodgers and Margaret Rodgers, I have no idea what happened to them. I believe that most of these people that did not pass away ended up in Ashley County. John C. Carpenter moved to Arkansas as well and served in the same company as well. Apparently, he was discharged at some point mid-war. Zeno Carpenter served in the 37th Arkansas Infantry, and I'm seeing some indication that he was discharged as well fairly early in the war. And George Washington Carpenter is my direct ancestor, and he disappeared somewhere after the surrender of the Army of Tennessee at the Bennett Place. He was part of the 41st Mississippi Company D. The Noxubee Guards was raised in Noxubee County. They were consolidated at the end of the war into the 9th Mississippi Consolidated, of which George Washington, known as G.W. Carpenter, and most of the records. Robert Manning refers to him as Washington, probably not to confuse him with the other brother George. But he was listed as being present and paroled in North Carolina. But after that, every amount of research, I have not come up with whatever happened to him. I believe family legend is that his wife disappeared with somebody else, and perhaps the person settling up the probate of the property. And folklore has that he went to Texas to find her and just never returned. His two sons ended up going to Ashley County, the Hamburg area, which is William Oliver Carpenter as well as Benjamin Carpenter. Benjamin being born in Noxubee County, and again, the younger brother, George Washington Benjamin Carpenter, born in 1863. The previous one, William Oliver, was born in 1860. Benjamin was born in Pickensville, across the border. But anyway, Robert Manning ended up going with his older brother, James, and John C. Carpenter to Ashley County, and he claims to have enlisted in Company B, the 26th Arkansas Infantry, after his brother, James, was killed at Prairie Grove. Would have enlisted in 63, probably late 63, and he participated in the Battle of Jenkins Ferry and the Red River Campaign. So I'll start with his story here. This is the life of The story of R.M. Rodgers, Confederate soldier, early county official, and educator, prepared by his daughter, Miss Alma Rodgers, in June of 1859. Again, this, excuse me, this story ended up uh, in the Sheridan Headlight, and was published in that newspaper apparently, but it was written years before by Robert Manning Rodgers to get his pension. Again, this is his picture right here, Robert Manning Rodgers, after the war as a school teacher in Sheridan County, Arkansas. And I will go back to his original picture here. You'll see there's somewhat of a resemblance, so I do believe this is Robert Manning Rodgers in uniform in 1863. Born in 1846 and died in 1912. Preface. Among the papers of Robert Manning Rodgers was found the story of his life, which he had written shortly before his death in 1912. This story, as he told it, has been copied for publication by his daughter, Alma M. Rodgers. She also supplemented his story by giving a sketch of his life while county treasurer in subsequent years, including copies of his papers relative to the establishment of his school in 1896. These facts, she felt, were pertinent to the story he had written and would be of interest to the reader. Robert Manning Rodgers. The subject of this sketch was born in Noxubee County, Mississippi on February 27, 1946. He was the son of John M. Rodgers and Mary Love Carpenter Rodgers. Both his parents had been previously married before their marriage in 1840. His father's children by his first wife were 4 sons and 2 daughters, namely William, James, John, George, Jane, and Margaret. His mother had 3 sons by her first husband, namely her first husband was with John Copernicus Carpenter. He died in the early 1830s after his sons were born in Alabama. The sons were John Washington, which is my great-great-grandfather, and Zeno Carpenter. Robert M. Rodgers had two own sisters, Mary and Tennessee. Both of his parents died when he was about 11 years of age. Again, I believe the date was 1849. 1859, I'm sorry. The following in his own words. I was born in Noxubee County, Mississippi, February 27, 1846. My parents were purely a Southern type. My father a Tennessean and my mother a native of Alabama. My father, John M. Rodgers, and his brother, Alexander Rodgers, left Tennessee at an early date and went down into Mississippi. Father settled in Noxubee County, while uncle settled in Chickasaw County. Father was a strong supporter of good schools and would contribute very liberally to the yearly salaries of our instructors. Although Father was never attached to any church, he was a constant Bible reader and would often pay as much to the support of the ministry as any church member. He took great delight in ministering to those who might chance to need help, and for that reason many came to him for counsel and aid. My mother was a devout woman, a consistent member of the Methodist Church. In the sweetest sense, she was indeed a mother. Father believed in the doctrine of states' rights and that the Constitution guaranteed the rights to hold slaves. However, he personally did not believe in slavery and would not own slaves. He owned a large cotton plantation on the Tom Bigbee River, and when he needed hands to work on his plantation, he hired Negroes from his neighbors who owned slaves. He shipped his cotton by boat to a commission merchant in Mobile, Alabama, and received all his supplies for the plantation direct from Mobile through his merchant. His plantation was located on the eastern part of the county. The soil was very fertile. Much prairie and sandy lands bordered the Tom Bigbee River. This was called the garden spot before the war. Immense plantations, owned and cultivated by large slave owners, extended this part of the county. Artesian wells, boiling springs, and running streams abundantly supplied the section of the country with water throughout the year. My schoolhood days. The old log house was the place of my early training. No excuses were granted in those days for any failure. It was the duty of every student to make an earnest effort to learn as well as to comply with the rules and regulations of the school. No allowances were made for the purpose of having a good time, as the young now expect. It was strictly a business matter. The students were governed and not coaxed. It is true, in many instances, while our teacher would be conducting a recitation, he would become very impatient because someone in the class had failed to come up to the requirements. This would sometimes be my condition, and my teacher, in his impatience, would strike me on the head with anything that might chance to be in his hand. Oftentimes, he would hold my head with his left hand while he would use his right as a mechanic would use his gimlet, declaring at the same time that if he had my head at a blacksmith shop, he might get some sense into it. These were frequent instances in the school. No doubt you would think this sufficient cause for my parents to complain, but this was not the case. My parents offered no complaint. If they ever complained at any time on the account of my treatment at school, I never heard of it. There was no partiality in the school. Every student was forced to comply with the regulations of the school. You may wonder if I learned. I can say I advanced rapidly in my studies. I studied hard and that I might have my lessons well prepared. Then, too, you may wonder if I loved my teacher. I can truthfully say I loved my teacher, and I loved him to this good day. I knew, in the first place, that my teacher was a good man, and when I studied to prepare my lessons well, it seemed to please him very much. I felt that he loved me and only expected me to discharge my duty. Parents, where are you who today find so many exceptions to your teacher's rules? My days at the academy. Let us look and see the rapid strides that had been made. On my father's plantation, a little town, Bigbee Valley, sprang up. The Baptists and Methodists had established strong churches, and the education interest had advanced from ordinary school house to the academy. At the academy, professors were employed and the very best instructions given. The school term usually commenced in January and continued throughout the year. I was the youngest boy of the Rodgers family. It was my misfortune to lose my parents at the age of 11 years. However, this did not interfere with my educational advantages. I was kept in school every year. When I was rather small, I was fond of committing pieces to memory. Such sections as Charge the Light Brigade and I Live For were my choice pieces. In the Bigbee Valley Academy, an amusing incident in the way of recitation took place when that was termed the fighting class was called to recite. There were many boys at this school of all ages, from 6 to 24, whose parents were very rich, and as was expected, many of these boys were very well qualified to engage in numerous fistfights, sometimes mingling with a few knockdowns and dragouts. I would at times feel my keeping and become mixed up with some of these schoolboys' outdoings. It so happened on one occasion, the old professor reminded us that a punishment was pending and that he would be forced, on account of his hand, to defer punishment. He was suffering with a sore hand, and he could not use it efficiently so our punishment was deferred. It was some 3 weeks, as I remember, before the professor's hand was entirely well. By this time, a number of fistfights had taken place, and of course, this necessitated the organization of a whole class. After the after the usual exercise of the day, the professor called for the fighting class to recite. You may imagine how I felt. I hardly knew how to proceed to a recitation of this kind, for the simple reason I would rather have been excused. As I rose rather hesitantly from my seat, the old professor called out, "Come along, Robert, you are in this class." My reply was that I was waiting to take the foot of the class. This caused a great deal of laughter. I could not do justice to such an occasion as this, therefore will leave it to you to picture this administration in your imagination, should you happen to be a party to a similar experience in the school room. I remained at school at the Bigbee Valley Academy. In the Bigbee Valley, I remained at the academy in Bigbee Valley, Mississippi until the year 1860, when the Rodgers children separated, each boy's going to a state of his choice. The separation of the Rodgers boys. In 1860, the Rodgers boys separated, each going to a state of his own choice. Brother James and myself came to Arkansas in the fall of 1860 and settled in Ashley County in the southern part of the state. It was understood that the administrator of our father's estate was to sell all the real and personal property so as to be able to close the estate and adjust our claims. The heirs were to return in the fall of 1861 and make an adjustment of all property claims, but before that time came hostilities between the North and the South and had commenced, and my brothers had already enlisted from their respective states, which made it impossible for us to get together. Never met again. We never met again. The war opened with flattering prospects for the South, but as each succeeding year came and went during that awful period, it brought only the evils consequence upon war. Brother James enlisted in the 26th Arkansas Regiment, Company B, and was killed at the Battle of Prairie Grove, Arkansas. Answering the strenuous call for troops in 1863, I enlisted in the same regiment and company. Then, a youth only 17 years of age, I entered the Confederate service and was in the famous Red River campaign. General Banks and Steele Federals. In the fall of 1863, the enemy had planned to invade the entire Trans-Mississippi Department, and in order to accomplish this, it was understood for General Banks to ascend the Mississippi River in gunboats and transports from New Orleans, thence up the Red River, and land a force from New Orleans, thence up the Red River, and land a force of 50,000 troops, while General Steele was to move from Little Rock with 12,000 troops to cooperate with the advance and join their great armies at Shreveport, Louisiana, and invade Texas. Confederates General Kirby Smith and Richard Taylor. General Smith's noble service at the battles of Manassas and Richmond, Kentucky had won the confidence of President Davis, and in 1863 he was made the leading general of the Trans-Mississippi Department. General Smith, foreseeing the danger which his country was about to undergo, and believing that prompt action to repel the invasion of the enemy, ordered General Richard Taylor, then in Louisiana, and his Texas troops to hold the enemy in check as much as possible until he, with the Arkansas and Missouri troops, could reach him and gave him the necessary aid. Hardly a day passed without a battle between the Texas troops and the enemy. Banks' army advanced all the while Taylor's falling back. The maneuvering and continuous fighting was kept up from day to day from the 10th of March until the 10th of April following. General Taylor made a firm, heroic stand at Mansfield, Louisiana on the 8th of April, at which time and place we were enabled to reach those brave Texas troops and give them much needed relief. Around noon of the 8th of April, for the first time, we heard the sound of musketry in the distance. This gave an impulse for a more rapid marching. Our army marched with as much speed as possible, and late in the afternoon we arrived at the battlefield. It was certainly a critical moment. The arrival of the Arkansas and Missouri troops inspired new courage, which resulted in an overwhelming victory for our forces. General Taylor, with his cavalry, had been fighting continuously from day to day the superior numbers of the enemy, 10 to 1 of the Confederate troops, and falling back, but now came a renewed determination on the part of his brave officers and men, with the assurances that the Arkansas and Missouri troops were now on the field. A thrill of courage and admiration ran along the entire Confederate line. And at this particular crisis, Walker's division, the Texas troops, gave a raking crossfire, and the victory was won. The enemy seemed to be overawed, broke lines in the most glaring confusion, and fled in the night, abandoning a large amount of arms, knapsacks, baggage, and supplies. The enemy was routed with considerable loss. The ground was strewn with those killed for several miles. Prisoners were taken. Pursuit was kept up the next day until the enemy, being reinforced with 10,000 troops, made a bold stand at Pleasant Hill. Battle of Pleasant Hill. About 1 o'clock in the afternoon of April 9th, the engagement at Pleasant Hill took place. The enemy had posted themselves just as after they had crossed in an extensive old field. This made it necessary for the greater part of our army to charge across this open field and bring on the attack and fight it out in the open. In order to get our respective positions before bringing on the attack, the Arkansas troops were ordered to move along a road leading to the right in double quick and to advance on the right wing, while the Texas troops were to advance on the center, and the Missouri troops on the left, and supported by the Texas cavalry along the entire line. Our artillery was stationed so as to play heavily on the enemy. The enemy's artillery gave us all the shells possible. The battle opened suddenly with heavy cannonading from both sides. Then, out of the opposite woods swept the entire Confederate army in battle line across the open field. The infantry and cavalry charged in solid line, while the enemy cannon poured shot and shell into our advancing columns. Fighting was continued with tremendous cannonading for both sides, all during the dreadful engagement of 60,000 men in open field. Infantry volleys smote the enemy's artillery. Late in the evening, the enemy's battle line was broken. No human endurance could stand that terrible fire, and whole companies rushed as prisoners into the Confederate lines. The battle raged dreadfully until nightfall, when the enemy fled from the field. General Greene, with his bold Texas cavalry, went thundering upon their heels, capturing many prisoners. The Union Army, now being dissolved into a rabble of demoralized fugitives who escaped as rapidly as possible to the cover of their gunboats. The loss of the enemy in this campaign was approximately 6,000 captured, 8,000 killed and wounded, 18 cannons, and a large amount of munitions of war. We learned from the federal prisoners that General Banks made a speech to his troops just before they commenced that memorable march to invade the Lone Star State. I would assume that General Banks' speech was something after the manner of Hannibal when he undertook the invasion of Italy. It may be that their speeches were somewhat alike, but their success in making an invasion was without a doubt quite different. General Banks' invasion was an utter failure. His brush fights he alluded to in his speech, in which he afterwards engaged, doubtless gave him a distaste for such of a mode of fighting. The army, which had started from New Orleans on a proud march through the country only a month previous to this, now hastened back to New Orleans totally disorganized. Too high praise could not be conferred upon the Confederate troops for their gallantry. All of the honor of victory was due to the bravery of the Confederate soldiers' battles, and soldiers' victories. Soon as it was known that we were no longer needed to drive the enemy back to New Orleans, we were ordered back to Arkansas to reinforce General Price, who was falling back against the superior numbers of the enemy, as General Taylor had been forced to do so in Louisiana. Before we could make this move and join our forces, detachments of the enemy had been defeated and prisoners had been taken at Mark's Mill and Poison Springs. To cooperate with General Price, it required much hard marching on the part of the Arkansas and Missouri and Texas infantry. From the 1st of March to the 30th of April, no time was to be lost in making this commemorable march of 300 miles, first from Arkansas into Louisiana, and then from Louisiana back into Arkansas. On Sunday evening, April 24th, we met our old commander, General Sterling Price, just as we were making a feint attack upon Camden. As the enemy approached the city from the north side, General Price fell back south of the city, and in making this move, we came up with him and his army. After throwing some 6-pounders into the enemy's outposts, we moved south about 8 miles into the camp. It was thought this move was made to draw the enemy south of the city, but some time in the night, the enemy stretched their pontoons across the river and took up a hurried march for Little Rock. It was reported that General Steele, before leaving the city of Camden, made a speech to his troops in which he stated that there were 80,000 rebels around the city and that no prisoners would be taken, and furthermore advised his troops that when they had to fight, to do so to the bitter end. General Steele had managed to increase his force with the Negroes who voluntarily offered to join his army. It was certainly a motley crowd of soldiers claiming to be part of the Grand Army of the Republic. Let us see what success this band of motley blue-bellied troops had. It was noon Monday before it was definitely known to us that the enemy had passed on the north side. We were ordered to prepare 3 days' rations and then take up line of march and pursuit. Our army arrived at Camden about night on Monday, and then commenced the tedious task of constructing a pontoon of plank. This was done during the night. It required all the next day for our army to cross the river. Wednesday morning, we took up our line of march. On Thursday, our rations gave out with most of our men. Friday, heavy rains set in. It was with great difficulty that we could march. The heavy rains continued to pour down all that night of the 29th of April. Our army continued to march that awful stormy night. The heavy rains, the vast trains of artillery, and the ordnance trains that moved along just ahead made it extremely difficult for the infantry to follow. Our march was continued until about daylight Saturday morning of April 30th. We had by this time reached the hill where there was a small house about 2 miles from Jenkins Ferry. This is now known as the Giles Farm. At this place, we were ordered to stack arms. We began to think our night's march was all in vain. It was not long, however, before our doubts were removed and the picket guns were soon heard firing in the distance. We were then ordered into line of battle and wait for our command. We remained in this line 20 minutes or more. This gave an opportunity for reflection. My thoughts went back to my childhood. Nothing could be plainer to my memory than the days of my childhood when my father and mother, brothers and sisters, could convene in the family circle and enjoy the sweet association of home, where peace and prosperity reigned. When those nights passed through my mind, I then thought of my present condition, a poor soldier boy, worn out by the fatigue of hard marching through the heavy rain, mud, and water without a moment's rest, suffering from hunger, and now standing in battle rank, waiting for orders to move into a dreadful battle. Tears came streaming down my cheeks. I could restrain my feeling no longer. Just as we were about to move forward, I took a small piece of old moldy bread, the only leavings of my haversack, for my breakfast, and marched down into that dreadful conflict. The Battle of Jenkins Ferry, April 30th, 1864. The enemy had taken just north of a small field along Cox Creek, behind logs and the timber in the river bottom, in such a way that it was extremely difficult for our forces to making the attack to march without considerable exposure to crossfire. We expected General Fagan's command to attack the enemy in our front while our forces advanced in the rear. This, no doubt, would have resulted in the capture of the entire Federal Army had General Fagan appeared north of the river. As it happened, a battle had to be fought by the weary Confederate troops in mud and water from shoe mouth deep to half leg deep, in a shameful disadvantage. The Arkansas troops advanced on the right wing, the Texas troops in the center, and the Missouri troops on the left, with the entire line covered by General Price's cavalry. Afterwards, finding that our location was extremely hazardous to our forces, we managed to strike alternately, as the battle could not be used to any advantage. A battle of heavy musketry fighting with a cannon shot occasionally raged dreadfully from early morning 6:30 to 1:30 in the afternoon. The Negro troops were stationed along Cox Creek in isolated places. As soon as the men could locate them, heavy musketry poured into their ranks, killing them by the scores. In the meantime, the enemy, drawn up in lines of obtuse angles and sheltered behind logs and the timber, continuously poured heavy crossfire into our lines, cutting our men down rapidly. At this crisis, one section of the Missouri battery was captured by the Negroes, only at the expense of all the lives of all the men who commanded this artillery. As soon as time and opportunity afforded, the battery was retaken, and there followed that might be termed Negro killing. Wow. Let me read that again. As soon as time and opportunity afforded, the battery was retaken, and there followed that might be termed Negro killing. The battle fought by Confederate troops at such a terrible disadvantage shows the great bravery on the part of the Southern soldier, who proved to the enemy that they could no longer remain ravaging the country of a brave, patriotic, and enlightened people. The enemy, after cutting down their wagon trains, spiking their cannons, and throwing them into the river, retreated across the river, leaving their dead and wounded on the field and a vast amount of baggage trains, cannons, and munitions of war. We had no pontoon to enable us to cross the river, so the enemy made good their escape. The Federal loss in this engagement was about 1,000 killed and wounded, besides the loss of cannons, baggage, trains, and a vast amount of war material. It was not so easy to concentrate their forces at Shreveport as was expected by the enemy. Another army sent back hurriedly to its place of rendezvous, totally demolished. It was I was a number among the unfortunate, wounded in my left arm around 9 o'clock in the morning of April 30th, when the battle seemed to reach its highest pitch. I was powder burned and my face smoked so black that my comrades could scarcely recognize me. While I was attempting to get off the field, I met my regimental surgeon, who called, "Is that you, Rodgers?" By the time my wound was very painful and the blood was flowing freely down my side and around my waist, my surgeon secured the necessary help, and I was taken back to a line of vehicles that stood just behind the battle ranks. My old comrade Grizzle and I were soon placed in one and conveyed at once to the hospital ground, where many poor wounded soldiers were being rapidly collected. Grizzle was beside me and was wounded at the same time I was. I remember very well the expression on his face at the time my gun was shot from my hand. I thought he was killed, but it so happened that he had received a severe wound from which he finally recovered. The hospital. We remained at the hospital. We remained on the battlefield for 3 days, after which we were removed to the hospital at Tulip. The serious condition that the soldiers may be placed can hardly be described. Imagination can only picture. Our baggage train had been sent to Texas, and of course, we were without change of clothing, and we were forced to remain in our blood-stained clothes for 9 or 10 days. The enemy had overrun the country, which made it almost impossible for the patriotic citizens to give aid to the wounded. However, with sympathizing hearts and rapid and ready hands, they did everything they could to give relief to the wounded soldiers. I had become despondent by that time. My clothes, saturated with blood for so long, had become very offensive, and flies were bad. Creeping things as large as wheat grains had now infested my body round my blood-stained clothes. This was the condition of many of my wounded comrades. My first nurse was very slothful and unconcerned, and on account of his unfaithfulness, he was discharged and ordered to report to the command without delay. My second nurse was a good man and was exceedingly careful with me. It was about 2 weeks after the battle I seemed to be getting weaker very rapidly and thought I must be dying. It was late in the afternoon of that day. It came my time to get a little bed, a clean shirt, and a pair of trousers. I remember my nurse called me and asked if I could bear for them to lift me and hold me up until they could change my clothes and place me in a small bed. I consented to this, although I was so very weak. While all this was taking place, I could see some wounded comrades in another part of the room dying. I knew nothing more from them for some time, and when I came to myself, I was lying on a little bed with clean clothes on, and my right hand and arm laid across my breast. Nature had changed. I soon fell into a deep sleep and enjoyed a good night's rest for the first time since my misfortune. When I awoke the next morning, I did not feel so weak, and from that time forward I began to improve. 2 weeks later, I was able to take leave of my wounded comrades that were still in the hospital. I left it in my I left in my company with my division surgeon who amputated my I left in the com I left in company with my division surgeon who amputated my arm on the battlefield and who now dressed my stub every morning on the way to Camden. At Camden, I bade adieu to my beloved surgeon and started on my way home in Ashley County. A few weeks later, I learned the sad news of my beloved brother, George, one just older than myself, had been killed in the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5th, only a few days after my misfortune. A sudden burst of grief came over me when I wept bitterly. The war was still going on. I, I took to cover of some partisan traitors who were I took to the cover of some partisan traitors who were certainly giving the enemy all the trouble that was in their power. It was their mode of fighting that kept the enemy from preying upon the country west of Vicksburg. However, the the unhealthy region did not agree with me. I was forced on account of my health to come back into Arkansas, where I remained until the close of the war. In January of 1865, a soldier friend who was then at home on furlough employed me to go back with him to his command to bring his mules home, as he did not wish to trust any of his Negroes. We started on our journey at the appointed time and made our way down the country into Louisiana by way of Bastrop, Monroe, and Columbia. And after traveling many miles down the Washita and the Red Rivers, we reached our friend's command. It required 6 days hard riding to make this route, owing to the bad conditions of the roads. After spending a day in camp with my friend, I began to prepare for my trip back home. An officer in the command, learning that I was to go back through the city of Monroe, his father's home, contracted with me to take a Negro boy, his servant, 16 years old, back to his father. Said he didn't need the boy and wanted him home. So after a day's rest, I started for home with this Negro boy. The weather was very bad. Streams everywhere were already full from much rain. Rain set in again that morning, and as well as I remember, it rained 4 days almost without ceasing, which caused the streams everywhere to overflow. But I pushed ahead regardless of the weather. I feared the jayhawkers in the wilderness country through which we had to pass. Luckily, no straggling crowd that we happened to see on our way gave us any trouble. Excuse me. All right, I'll continue. When we reached the ferry on the Washita, we heard the news that the Federals were at Monroe, Bastrop, and Hamburg. It was indeed hard for me to believe such report. I had just passed down through that portion of the county and could not credit any such dispatch. After crossing the river, I went on with my Negro boy in the direction of Monroe, intending to stay all night with the boy's mother. It was still pouring down rain. The road was hardly passable, especially in the hammock country on the river. Shortly, we met a man who told us the Federals were at Monroe. This was frequent news, as everyone who saw us gave us the same report, and the Federals were at Monroe. Heedless of what anyone told me, I was determined, if possible, to make the old house where my soldier friend and myself stayed all night on our way down. Fortunately, we reached it about 4 o'clock in the evening. It was still raining. I called to know if I could get a meal for myself and the Negro boy, also get my mules fed. The kind lady informed me that we could have dinner and the mules fed, but my husband, but my husband is out helping about the property, as the enemy is likely to come along at any time. I said, "You don't say so." "Yes, sir, the Yankees are now at Monroe, which is only 5 miles from here," she said. So as soon as we ate our dinner and our mules fed, we paid our fare and started on our journey in the direction of Monroe. We traveled south 2 miles when we saw at a distance a body of troops, as we thought, coming from the direction of Monroe. At this time it seemed to be getting dark, but of course it was only the deep darkness of the cloudy, rainy evening. I then reminded the Negro boy of our situation, that in case this body of troops proved to be the enemy, it would be useless for us to try to escape, that if we attempted to run, we would both be killed, and the only way for us would be to ride on until we were halted. We kept the road until we came up to the approaching troops, as we thought, and kept riding as though we intended to pass through the crowd, when my attention was directed to an elderly gentleman who wished to know where I was going. I saw at once that the throng of people were only citizens. I told the gentleman where we were going. "Well," said he, "I know you are by your looks, and I must inform you that the Federals are now in the city, and that if you continue to travel in that direction, you will be captured. Furthermore," he said, "I am the postmaster of the city, and have just destroyed all the mail department to keep it from falling in the hands of the enemy. So come along with me. I know all the trails of this country. You can guess, my friends, that I felt as if I had found a Moses, and I was willing to follow his instructions. My guide informed me that there was a private ferry about 2 miles below, and if it was not too crowded with property from all parts of the country, we could effect a crossing. But if it should be crowded, he knew of another private ferry just back up the river, which he would get to and make a crossing. We soon came to the first ferry, and sure enough, it was surrounded by mules and Negroes from the different plantations waiting for an opportunity to cross. No time was to be lost, so back we rode up the river in the direction of Monroe, expecting every moment to meet the enemy. It was extremely dark, with continuous rain and with thunder and lightning in the west. Luckily for us, we reached the turning point out from which the main road, and late in the night came to our private ferry. The old colored man who had charge of the ferry, after we found out who we were, gladly put us across the river, gave us instructions how to travel through the backwater of the Washita. A short distance from the ferry, we were to leave the main road and take a dim route, which could only be kept by stopping a short distance along and by feeling the blaze of the trees. Before we undertook this dangerous route, my guide suggested that we exchange horses, as my mule was very large and would likely give me trouble, and this and that his horse was very gentle and would be entirely safe in swimming the water. I accepted my friend's proposition, exchanged horses, and then we started on our dark, perilous way. It was very dark and still raining, with lightning and thunder in the west. My guide traveled in front, feeling the blazes of the trees, and calling out along the route with me and the Negro, "Come ahead." We traveled in the overflow for some time and seemed to be getting along about as well as could be expected. Then suddenly we came to a tract of country where the water began to get deeper and deeper, and without a moment's warning, my horse became frightened and threw me off into the water. As it happened, I held to my horse and he carried me out of the deep water. I caught I caught to a tree lap and saved myself until my guide could come to my assistance. "Well," my friend said, "that was a drift, and certainly something must have struck my horse to cause him to act in that manner. I am truly sorry. Let us exchange horses again, and take your mule, and I will take my horse," which we did. And we traveled on then without further difficulty through our route, was although our route was very tedious and very dangerous. About 2 o'clock in the morning, we reached a hill on the road leading west from Monroe. It was still raining. The thunder in the west had ceased, and it seemed to be growing louder. I'm sorry. The thunder in the west had ceased, and it seemed to be growing colder. My guide informed me that the Negro boy's master lived in the city, but in order to get out of the way of the enemy, had crossed the river into his summer home, situated somewhere on this road. I thanked my guide for his kind assistance, and after compliments, we parted and never met again. I understood to get information concerning this Negro boy's master, the first house, but failed. At the second and third houses, I also failed, traveling all the while in the direction of Monroe, believing it to be unsafe to go any further in the direction of Monroe. I took my way back to the first house. The Negro boy stated that we were near his master's house, but for his life, he could not tell just where it stood. So I called again at our first house, stating that I was a Confederate soldier and a friend wishing to get some very important information. An answer, "What is it?" in a woman's voice given. I said I wished to know the whereabouts of a certain citizen, giving at that time my reason for wanting such information. The desired information was readily given. I thanked the lady for her kindness, and we proceeded to the gentleman's residence. He was considered very rich. Fearing that my troubles might be increased at such a time, I took my 6-shooter from around my neck and shoulders, where I had been carrying it while crossing the backwaters, and rode directly up to the porch. All of all of my calling and yelling were in vain. I dismounted with the pistol in hand, walked into the house, kicking the hall door, and then the room doors open as I went. I could see no one. The fire was still in the fireplace, and not a soul to be found. The man had left with his family and Negroes for another place of his just 20 miles away. The Negro boy put our mules into the stalls and gave them plenty of corn and fodder. It had ceased raining and seemed to be getting colder. After caring for the mules, the boy made a fire in the fireplace, which soon dried our wet clothes, and then we indulged in good sound sleep. I awakened the next morning by someone calling at the gate. The sun was shining, and the frosty dewdrops sparkled in the sun rays on the bright morning. I arose, stepped to a window nearby, and to my surprise, there stood about 800 cavalry, seemingly dressed in blue uniforms. Interesting. Note the blue uniforms. By this time, the Negro was on his feet. I beckoned silently to him not to run. I walked out into the hall porch. I received a salute from the commanding officer. He thought I was the owner of that fine residence. I am sure, dear reader, that you can imagine I felt very honored to be thought of the owner of that fine residence and to be talking to a great cavalry commander. But you may know for sure that his inquiry gave me instant relief, since I thought that they were Federals without a doubt. He wished to know the whereabouts of the Federals, for they were expecting a fight. Of course, I knew nothing, only from reports that the Federals were in Monroe, and it was not certain that they would cross the river. This body of cavalry then marched in the direction of Monroe. I'll stop here and comment on this cavalry force. Previous research, when I read this years ago, I believe this is either the 6th or the 3rd or the 6th Louisiana Cavalry. It required some consideration to my part just now to decide on what to do with my Negro boy. I had fulfilled my promise faithfully in getting him and the mules back to their master's home. Believing the boy to be honest in his intentions, I agreed to release him on the promise that he would go to his master, who he said had moved to the other house. We saddled the mules, placed corn in the sacks in a sack for them, and we parted. The Negro started south while I took an opposite direction towards Monroe. I was anxious to see a fight between this command of cavalry and the Yankees. I did not get far, however, before I met a fellow coming as though he expected to make a good active run. "Hello, good morning," I said in a cheerful mood. "What seems to be the matter?" "The Yankees are crossing the river at Trenton and are coming this way," he said. So I let him pass and traveled in the direction of Monroe. A few moments later, I saw someone coming and riding very hurt. A few minutes later, I saw someone come riding very hurriedly. This man was riding a pony, which looked more like a zebra than a horse. On his sudden approach, I yelled at the top of my voice, "Hello, good morning. What's your hurry?" In answer, the fellow said, "They done crossed the river." "Who has crossed the river?" I said. "The Yankees. They done be crossed over and got into my boot shop and towed it up. Our men have just gone in that direction. Don't you suppose that there will be a fight?" I said. "Oh, they done be moving. They won't be breakfast spell," he said. On my Dutch mare went up under a whip without any further communication. Sorry, I couldn't read the vernacular. After passing the Dutchman, I began to think of the course that I was pursuing. Following this cavalry command to see a fight was only placing myself in a position to be captured in case of a stampede. Then I thought, suppose I am captured and some of the enemy suspicious me. Of course, I would be killed. After due consideration, I decided to take an opposite direction. I made a circuit of 150 miles, traveling by way of Farmersville, Hillsborough, moving northwest and dropping down into Morrow Landing on the Washita River. After crossing the river at that point, I moved north and northeast to Warren, and then down to Longview and crossed the Saline River. By taking this route, I passed clear out of danger line of 3 detachments of the enemy that were stationed at Monroe, Bastrop, and Hamburg. Of course, this required many days additional travel, as the roads were in deplorable condition. Sometimes I was forced to swim creeks on my way. In the course of 2 weeks, I made my circuit and arrived home just a few days after the enemy had left Hamburg. Well, I thought, here I am back in my old soldier county. Nothing further of interest happened to me until the sad news of the surrender of General Lee and all the Confederate forces. Allow me to say here that I love for the love I always had for my commanders, General Kirby Smith, Price, Churchill, Colonel Gill, Adjutant Raglan, and Captain Gibson, that no better men ever lived and no braver officers ever served the command as commanders in the battle ranks of the Confederate cause. The war was at an end. Our new state of things confronted the South. The war was over, but desolation had ruined, and ruin resulted in only to the Southern people. They had sacrificed thousands of their sons, lost their property, and suffered untold insults of an invading enemy, which brought desolation and ruin to many happy and prosperous homes. And in addition to all this, this cause for which they so earnestly, faithfully, and bravely contended was now lost. This condition made it only the worse for the unfortunate Confederate soldier who had once been rocked in the cradle of peace and prosperity and now stood almost alone and lost in all his brothers in adversity and poverty with an empty sleeve. The schools throughout the South had been closed for 4 long years, now began to open in every town and community. The Southern soldiers returned to their ruined and desolated homes with the same courage that afforded them the strength to fight against superior numbers on the battlefield. My attention was directed to the importance of attending school. I could now realize the great benefit of my early training. I was kept in school until I was 15 years of age, when the war between the states absorbed all the attention of the South. I cannot refrain from mention of my old fatherly friend Thomas Haley and his kind family of Ashley County for their many kindness they bestowed upon me of Honorable A.W. Files and noble-hearted, patriotic Christian gentlemen who gave so much needed assistance to those trying moments. I was a student in Hamburg School until 1866, when I returned to my native state. Here I found things quite different from what they were when I left in 1860. It bore the scars of that something which had pervaded the once beautiful, prosperous, and happy home of my childhood days, and had wrought a change that could hardly be described by anyone. Instead of the prosperous plantation once cultivated by slaves, there were old, dilapidated farms with no white men to see after them. In our little town of Bigbee Valley, there could be seen an old drugstore and an old deserted store buildings. The Baptist and Methodist church houses in the old academy were still standing as a record of once prosperous, happy, and enlightened people who had lived in that country. My father's plantation was owned and cultivated then by others. You'll remember that my father's estate was to have been closed by the administrator for the purpose of settling with the heirs in the fall of 1861. This was never done. Just before my return, the administrator died and his estate was worthless. The sureties of his official bond took the benefit of the bankruptcy law. So you see how the settlement with the heirs was made. The administrator was derelict in his duty and made some blundering reports, neglecting the vast amount of personal property. All records had been destroyed. There seemed to be nothing I could do to reclaim any of my father's property. But fortunately for me, I attended school in 1866 and then in 1867 under the instruction of an old college professor. He was a leading ex-Confederate and had served on General Greene's staff in the Red River campaign, as was with General Greene when he was killed by shell from an enemy's gunboat. Private schools opened for the year, and it was very rare that a community could be found without a school. I taught my first school in the fall of 1867, and I continued going to school and teaching until I completed my course. Of course, there was no available colleges at that time for the Southern youth. It was about the year 1870 before the Southern colleges opened. Cotton remained high. Cotton commanded a high price, and of course, everything else of market value was at a high price. Teachers received good salaries. In the fall of 1869, I married Miss Naomi Annie Allison. To us, 7 children have been born, 3 of whom died in early childhood. Only 3 girls survived. The youngest boy died at the age of 23. I must take my reader back to my native state, which had been struggling with the Reconstruction troubles and carpetbag rule for some time after the war. The Republican Party inaugurated a system termed public free school system in 1870. It was really a magnificent scheme for scalawags and carpetbaggers. More properly speaking, it might have been termed a kinky head system, for the scalawags could get enormous salaries for teaching colored schools. The discrimination made in the salary of a Southern white teacher employed to teach a white school, and that of the carpetbagger and scalawag in the North to teach a colored school was from $50 to $75 per month in favor of the Negro schools. Dignitaries in the shape of county superintendents administered the school affairs of their respective counties with a high hand. These lords and hell devils of the North kept up strife and confusion throughout the country until the Reconstruction period had fully passed. The South finally succeeded in throwing off the tyrannical yoke of the carpetbag rule and in placing the governmental affairs in the hands of her own people. The Democrats framed a new constitution and argued in efficient systems of public schools. The administration of the school affairs of the South has since proved a blessing to the youth in the South. Her schools have prospered from the rural districts to the high schools until now. She may be found among the leaders of the world in education advancements. I continued to teach in Mississippi until 1874, when I left with my family for Texas, stopping in this Grant County, Arkansas. For the summer, I taught that session. Let me start over. I continued to teach in Mississippi until 1874, when I left with my family for Texas, stopping in this Grant County, which is actually Grant County, Arkansas. For the summer, I taught that session at Liberty Church. In the winter, we continued our journey to Texas, where we remained 7 years teaching all the while. In the winter of 1861, we returned to Grant County, where we have made our home for 29 years, during which time I have served my county 8 years as treasurer and 8 years as county examiner, now county superintendent. The remainder of the 29 years I have spent in the school room teaching. My attention has been given wholly to the advancement of the educational interest of Grant County, and for this reason, I established a normal school at Sheridan in 1896. I have maintained the confidence of the school interest of the county for 13 years and have given instruction to some 300 students of this and adjoining counties. As evidence of our work, many of the students of the normal schools now hold positions of honor and trust. In concluding my story, I beg to say to the good patriotic people of Arkansas, I served you faithfully in time of war and have borne misfortune for my country's sake patiently. I have tried to live so as to honor my country's name, and to have striven to aid in the upbuilding of her institutions in order that she may be placed in the foremost rank of the investment and development of every enterprise that may place her name among the leading states of the Union. Our friendship and devotion to the old Confederate soldier I have never doubted in any time, and if there is anything in store for me in the way of relief in my declining years, it is to present you with the brief history of my past life. In cordial feelings for all, I here subscribe my name. Sincerely, Robert M. Rodgers. That concludes his part of the story. I'll continue on. During the 8 years father was treasurer, and this is his daughter appending to his story when she published his memoir. During the 8 years father was treasurer of the county and had no bank in the county. Therefore, when father was first elected, he had to make arrangements to take care of the money in the home, as did his predecessors in office. A few days before he took his oath of office, he went to Pine Bluff, purchased the strongest trunk that could be found in the city, one with a good lock and key. This trunk has a large tray in the upper part of which contains several compartments, and these compartments he kept most of the valuables and papers. The money was kept in the bottom of the trunk in stacks and strong cloth sacks, which were arranged in regular order, sacks of nickels, dimes, quarters, half dollars, and dollars. The gold in sacks of $5, $10, and $20 coins. There was considerably more money in coins in circulation in those days than we see today. We seldom see a silver dollar in this part of the country now, and no gold in circulation at all since our government went off the gold standard. The paper money, or greenbacks, as it was often called, was in stacks of 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50, and $100 bills. Father's trunk is now 75 years old and sits in the and is still in the family in good condition. When the oldest girl in the family, Mary Julia Roberts, was married in 1894, her father gave her the trunk. It is now the property of Doris L. McClellan, the granddaughter of M. Julia Rogers Hicks, and great-granddaughter of Robert M. Rogers. Father and mother never left the home at the same time during the entire 8 years he was treasurer. One always remained at home until the other returned, if it became necessary for one to be away. No one had access to the key. Father kept it in his possession at all times, and the trunk was kept locked. He would occasionally tell us about the money and why we should never touch anything when he had the trunk open. He would explain to us about the different pieces of money, its value, etc. And we understood that what was kept in the trunk was of no concern of ours. It was all strictly business. Therefore, no child in the family went about the trunk when father had it open. After the collection of taxes each year and the apportionment of the tax money due to be turned over to the treasurer of Grant County, by the county collector as well as from the state had to be delivered in cash since we had no bank. Father would make a trip to Little Rock to get the county's money from the state, and he usually went horseback to Redfield, our nearest railroad, and there board the train to Little Rock and would return over the same route. I remember distinctly a number of times he would come home with the money, greenbacks, soon sewn inside the lining of his vest, which he kept buttoned during the trip back home. Mother would help him get the money out of his vest and put it in the trunk. The silver and gold was carried in his saddlebags. However, he would request that most of the money he was to receive be in bills because of the way he had to travel. I shall never forget the kind looking gun he had. I knew nothing about the names of such weapons, but I would call it a large pistol. It had an ivory colored handle and would carry 6 loads. It was kept in the mantle through the day, but at night it was kept under his pillow. When his term of office expired, he sold the gun to E.B. Toller, a newly elected sheriff of the county. Father was appointed county examiner 4 times, making a total of 8 years he served. In that capacity, he also taught school in various districts of the county, during which time he served as examiner. After he established his commercial normal school in 1896, he devoted most of his time to the duties of his school, which was located just north and adjoining his home on Oak Street in Sheridan. Father's health failed in 1911, and he was forced to close his school. In the spring of 1912, Father's friends persuaded him to enter the race for county treasurer, which he finally agreed to. He received a good majority in the Democratic primary, but Father did not live to receive his endorsement at the time. General election had to take his oath of office. His old home on the southeast corner of Block 27, Sheridan, Arkansas, just west of the Court Square, and at the corner of Oak and Pine, is now the site of the County Memorial Library. In this library will be found the bookcase made from 2 cedar trees and grew in our yard of our home. Let me start over. I'm getting tired. In the library will be found a bookcase made from 2 cedar trees that grew in the yard of our home. These trees were planted by my mother about 58 years ago. When these trees were removed for the construction of the library, I asked that they give them to me as if they were not to be used about the building in any manner, which request the commissioners readily granted. I received the logs and had them sawed into lumber, and as soon as the lumber was seasoned sufficiently, had them made into the bookcase, which is now in the library and contains some of Father's books and copies of the story of his life, which he had written. This I did in memory of my father and mother, and hope that the facts contained in the books in this bookcase may be of interest to others. Father and mother loved their home and loved the good people of Sheridan and Grant County, among them who they had lived for more than 40 years. Alma M. Rodgers. And she makes a couple of notations here at the end. 14th annual announcements of the Sheridan Commercial Normal School. Apparently this was the giving the fees associated with attending the school. The Sheridan Commercial Normal School began at Sheridan, Arkansas on the 13th day of March 1911 for a term of 4 months. Tuition per scholar per month. Practical branches for $2. Higher branches $3. Bookkeeping $3. payable monthly in advance. All students who complete the course of study prescribed by this school after passing an approved examination will receive diplomas. The examination papers of all the students receiving diplomas shall be graded and filled in all the office room of this school, subject to the inspection of the county examiner or any school board of Grant County. Full credit will be given to the work of any public school conducted by a first grade teacher. The discipline of the school will be mild but firm. We are indeed very thankful to those who have given us such liberal patronage in the past and ask that the good people of Grant County give us a rousing attendance of this session. Cordially yours, R.M. Rodgers, Principal. And that concludes his story, The Life of Robert Manning Rodgers. I received the digital copy of this story. I had once had it in my possession and during subsequent moves had misplaced it. But I think the library in Grant County who supplied this to me, I would love to visit that to see if there's anything else, information pertaining that, but I suspect that they have some more information about Robert Manning Rodgers in their collection. Anyway, thank you, and I hope this is of interest to somebody.